Coming up on Regarding Men, speak no, hear no, see no, female evil.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Regarding Men, where we hold men in high regard and where red-pilled isolation comes to die. I'm Janice Fiamengo. I'm the author of The Fiamengo File, and I'm joined by my good friends Paul Elam of paulelam.com and Tom Golden of Men Are Good.
Men are good.
And today we're discussing basically media bias and double standards. This is one of our perennial subjects, of course. And we note often how these double standards about men and women mean that compassion and empathy tend to be denied to men, and accountability tends to be denied to women. And that's what we're going to see today in a couple of stories that we're going to discuss. The main story concerns something that happened last week in Australia, really dreadful triple homicide and suicide, a story in which a mother killed her 3 children and then killed herself. And what's very striking about the story is that because of the double standards that we're all pretty familiar with, the story really is a difficult one for the media to talk about honestly and even to reveal details of what happened. So we're going to start off just reading through the first paragraphs of the news report. And this is kind of a standard report. You can find all sorts of similar reports in Australian papers. In which we notice details about how the story is presented that seem to shield the mother from blame or responsibility, and really prevent the full story from being told because one suspects it may be too horrific for public consumption. Though if the father had been the perpetrator, we highly suspect that that wouldn't have been the case. So let's start reading through. Maybe I'll read a couple of the first sentence paragraphs there, and we can comment on them. Is that okay, guys?
Good. Yeah, go.
Sure.
Okay, so here's the story. Police believe a Victorian mother killed her 3 children before taking her own life after the 4 were found dead in a northwest Melbourne home. Multiple media outlets have identified the victims of Thursday's tragedy in Tullamarine as Katie Perinovich, 42, and her children, Claire and Anna, age 7 and 5, and 3-year-old Matthew. And this is, now just to pause there, this report comes a day after the first reports came out, I think, about the incident in which it had not yet been determined that the mother was responsible for the deaths of the 3 children. So there are initial reports that you can find on the internet where police have not yet made a determination. And it's quite interesting in those reports that I think, clear implication, although I do have to give it to police, they said that they had not yet made any judgments about guilt and responsibility. But it's pretty obvious from those early reports that there was a kind of assumption that the father must have been involved in some way and that ultimately he was going to be found responsible. And so you had all sorts of discussions in the papers about what a wonderful mother she was, and how she was just, her kids were just so happy, and it was a wonderful family, and she was a wonderful mother, and everybody knew her, and she was just the kind of woman that you wanted to have a conversation with, and you wanted to be with her in the neighborhood, and people loved her, and just incredible gushing about how great she was. That died off, although it's not completely absent from the later reports once the police had determined that she was responsible. That kind of mutes down, and there's discussion instead about how she had been notably quiet in the days and weeks preceding this incident. And so obviously the immediate go-to response of the persons writing these articles is, okay, this is building up to a statement about the mother's mental illness, that's going to be the angle. She had been quiet, she was struggling, she was having a difficult time. That has to be the lens upon which or the lens that we use to read this story. I also thought it was really interesting right there at the beginning that this is called a tragedy. Now, maybe I'm reading a bit too much into things, and maybe that's just the standard lingo for any kind of horrific incident like this. We'd have to read a lot of reports about, different crimes of this nature in order to come to a determination. But, tragedy, it does tend to be used quite usefully. It does tend to be used fairly loosely in situations like this. Just means bad thing. But it definitely also has the implication that it's something like it's a fated kind of thing. There's an element that it's beyond the control of those who are involved in it. As if this woman, although she has been determined legally responsible by the police, that somehow she isn't really responsible. It's just a horrible thing that she was swept up in, and for which she can't really bear blame.
Right. And I think one of the things you can do with stories like this, anytime there's a murder or something like that, is to look at whose story gets told.
Yeah.
Who gets mentioned and whose story gets told. And if you look at these articles, what you'll see is that it's the mother whose story gets told. It's her neighbors, her family, her story about what she was like and what she wasn't like. And the father is completely omitted. You just don't hear a thing about him. And you can see this in almost any article about some crime such as this. The person whose story gets told is the person who they're supporting, who they're trying to say is okay. The person whose story doesn't get told, those are the persons that are going to get blamed.
Yeah, very good point, Tom. Absolutely.
It is. And you bring that up. The two things I remember from reading several news accounts of this is that the only thing ever mentioned by about the father was, one, that he was grief-stricken, and two, that he was ruled out of any kind of accountability for the crime. But I mean, surely a man who's just had all of his children murdered, and this is a much bigger story for him than it is even the mother.
Of course.
She's the murderer here.
Yes.
But they have totally, he just all but does not exist, because the people in the media writing about this story across the board, and it didn't matter which publication I went to, across the board, they're all fixed on taking this story down a path that paints the mother as a victim, ultimately.
Yes.
That there was some, Janice mentioned the use of the word tragedy. I think the implication is that it was her tragedy, that in the end something tragic happened to her to cause this to happen.
Yes.
And of course, the police now won't even talk about the manner of death. They have said that it was gruesome. I think, knowing Australia, there's strict weapons laws in Australia. There's no guns allowed. I mean, people are not allowed to own guns. I'm assuming here, and I think others in the media have as well, that it was a stabbing that took the lives of the children. But that is a horrific, horrible way for children to die. And rather than focus on that tragedy, that real tragedy, the loss of life in the children, these guys are already playing kissy face with the murderer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And trust me, if this was about a man who had stabbed his 3 children, the headline would have read, "Man stabs 3 children." You know, it's like they would have talked about exactly what he did. You know, this doesn't say what she did. It omits it. Like Paul said, it's actually an incredible omission when you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's just, before we continue on the discussion, let's read through the rest of it. Sorry, I was the one that stopped it. But just so people see that what you were saying, we have to go back a bit to that first screen, Tom, because it still has some interesting stuff in it. And your point, Tom, about how like the grieving father is, you know, almost completely omitted from the heart of this story. And of course, if our viewers are interested in following up, there's a whole bunch of other, of course, reports about this. One of the early ones mentions that, or it even might be later in this report, I got them all mixed up now, but one of them mentions that the first thing that a neighbor saw, or the first indication that something was amiss, was a neighbor looking out and seeing the police at the home, and the father sitting outside with his hands behind his back, sitting on a chair with his hands behind his back. And you pointed this out, Tom, that, you know, what was he doing with his hands behind his back? Well,
handcuffs.
We are, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's a pretty good bet that you don't sit in a chair stunned by the grief, the horror of what you have just discovered in your home. You don't sit with your hands behind your back. You might sit with your head in your hands or something like that. The fact, you know, he was probably handcuffed. I did see a report by a men's rights organization on Facebook that they were alleging that the father had been harassed or beaten even by police. I don't know that that's true, but we do know for sure he was taken to the police station, probably handcuffed. He was kept overnight in a cell, and he was released the next day when they had determined that he wasn't involved. But that's the first thing they did. They handcuffed him. They took him back to the police station, and he was kept overnight in a jail cell. I cannot imagine that happening to the mother in a similar kind of situation where the sexes were reversed.
Correct.
And that's never the focus of any of these articles. How shocking that is, how horrific that the man who is bereaved, who had his entire family slaughtered, was also the initial suspect who spent that first night in a jail cell. I mean, it's just awful. And even just reading on here, just to Tom's point about the disappearance of the man, even now that it's been determined he was not involved, but the disappearance of him as a grieving human being from the story is gobsmacking. It says Tomislav Perinovich, 48, believed to be the woman's husband and children's father. I have no idea why they put it that way. I mean, obviously he was her husband and the children's father. Everybody knew that. They'd lived there for years. Called emergency services to report the deaths about 12:20 p.m. on Thursday. He assisted police and has been released without charge, a Victoria police spokeswoman said on Friday. And now here we get into the astounding erasure of the man's grief from the discussion of how this has shattered the community. Let's go to the next screen. She said detectives had also spoken with other family members, friends, and neighbors of the deceased with a report to be prepared for the coroner. Homicide squad investigators have formed the preliminary view that the 42-year-old woman is responsible for all 4 deaths, the spokeswoman said in a statement. Acting Deputy Commissioner Robert Hill said police would continue to support the families of those involved over the coming weeks. That's kind of weird. The families of those involved, like, okay, yes, there are other people, but the father is the primary one, but not a mention of him. And let's keep going.
All right.
It gets even more ridiculous.
Yep.
I know there will be many people in the community struggling to understand and come to terms with this tragedy, he said. This has also been an incredibly difficult time for both the police and paramedics who responded and attended the scene yesterday. This has been an incredibly heart-wrenching experience for all concerned.
Uh-oh.
Except the father.
Yeah. Who got left out there?
Man, I mean, that is just... And I'm sure that they came to the conclusion he wasn't involved, much to their chagrin.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you know, they wanted to tag something on this guy. They
Right.
wouldn't have kept him overnight. I'm sure that any seasoned homicide investigator could have looked at that crime scene and known in 5 minutes what happened there. They kept this guy overnight, put him in handcuffs during the most vulnerable, grief-stricken moment of his life. He was treated like a piece of dirt, and the follow-up journalism on this only confirms that. This is a tragedy for the community. It's even a tragedy for the police.
Yeah.
But let's not talk about the tragedy for the father. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that, they talk about how the paramedics and those people who responded, the police, are going to be, traumatized by all this.
Yeah.
But to leave out the dad, I mean, he's the one who's really, can you imagine being in that scenario? It's just, it's incomprehensible. And he's been treated as though he's the problem. So,
yeah. And they one of the articles mentioned that there's no history of domestic violence in this home, at least not the police having been called.
Right.
I bet if there had been anything, if this woman had ever complained about this man, he would have had an even worse time than what he already did have. But, there was simply nothing that they could pin on him. There was no way they could say that she was acting, under duress because she was an abuse victim or anything like that. And so, the fact that he was kept overnight in a jail cell, that's not even mentioned as a shocking injustice or as an added horror that he had to experience, although it must certainly have been for him. And as you say, Paul, I can't believe, he called, as far as I could understand, this happened right around this time. He came home, found his family killed, and called the police immediately. And so what must have, as you say, Paul, it must have been evident that he couldn't possibly have been involved. If he had been, he would have been covered in blood, or, there would have been some kind of evidence that could be very quickly ascertained. So clearly he wasn't, and yet they still insisted on handcuffing him, it seems, don't know that for sure, and taking him down to police headquarters and keeping him there overnight. I just awful, this is what happens to a grieving dad.
Yes. And the total lack of accountability to the mother, too. See no, hear no, speak no, female evil.
Yeah.
It's like that's what we see here. We see that it's almost impossible for journalists to be able to hold the mother accountable.
Yeah.
They want to hold the father accountable, but they can't now. But they will not hold the mother accountable,
No.
And
no.
It's amazing how much our culture is able to do that and get away with it.
Yeah. It's amazing how many traditions that this sort of thing turns on end, because you look at the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yes.
In journalism, man, a woman, anybody stabbing their 3 children to death or whatever manner that she used to execute them, that is great headlines. That is great for clickbait, for getting traffic. And this is the way, they say if it bleeds, it leads for a reason. Yet even that is suddenly the brakes are put on. We can't talk about the manner of death. Where are the journalists in these stories? They said the police didn't reveal the manner of death. Where are the journalists that are going to the police station or calling the police and saying, look, we need answers. You've got to answer how these people were killed. Why isn't that part of the story here?
Yeah.
Because guess what? if it bleeds because a woman did it, it doesn't necessarily lead.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's
it. And I read about 8 or 10 articles about this, and you know, they're all very similar in that sense.
Yes.
As I said, often the articles are quite long, and they go around talking to everybody in the neighborhood, and there's this predictability of response. Initially, it was all about what a great mother she was. There was still some of that even after it was known. I mean, imagine publishing an article with people quoted saying what a great mother she was, even once it's been known that she murdered her 3 children. But there is that. But then there's this other narrative about how she was quiet. And yes, we saw her last month and she seemed a bit quieter than normal. And this is building up that she was so, you know, she was depressed or she was unwell in some way. There was only one mention in one of the articles about somebody hearing very loud shouting about half an hour to 45 minutes before the police arrived at the home. And that obviously had to have been this woman shouting as she was murdering her children.
Yep.
So it doesn't fit and that's never followed up in any of the other articles that I read. Obviously, it doesn't fit the narrative of the quiet, depressed, emotionally distraught mother who didn't know what she was doing and must not be held responsible for her heinous act. But it certainly does suggest that there is a story here of horrific violence that the media is not interested in talking about.
Yes. And if they do happen to talk about the female whose evil bleeds into the article, they look for excuses. Either A, she was abused as a child, or B, she has mental health issues.
Yeah.
You know?
Or C, the husband abused her and
Yes,
she finally acted out.
Well said. Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some excuse. You know, you cannot hold women accountable for this kind of thing. You can see that, you know, it's 62 or 52% of the sentence given to men is given to women for the same crime. Same crime.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're not accountable. They're not held accountable.
It's a great example of what Tanya Reynolds has found in her psychological research about how we just tend to give, and not everybody, of course, because I did also read Reddit commentary, and there were a lot of people who weren't taking the position of the dominant mainstream narrative that a woman must never be held. Yeah, commenters are, you know, they have a variety of responses, and they certainly don't necessarily buy that a woman is never responsible. But that general cultural difficulty in attributing agency to women and the general cultural difficulty in feeling empathy for men is certainly very strongly borne out, at least by the mainstream media narratives.
Yes, and you can see that in spades in this article.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's just crazy.
And other similar stories. I know we're going to go into a little bit of others similar. I know the Andrea Yates story, and it's what I was thinking about with that. I remember that murder. She murdered her 5 children, drowned them all in a bathtub, just about 20 minutes from where I lived in Houston. That was a local crime for me.
Yes.
And what was so infuriating, both fascinating and infuriating, there was, you know, a fan club developing to save this woman. There were lots of people writing her in prison. She had marriage offers and stuff. And that happens, you know, that happened with Scott Peterson too. That's not just a phenomenon that's restricted to women. But one moment in that whole story really will never leave my mind. I was getting a haircut about a week after this hit the news. And the woman cutting my hair, while she's cutting my hair, the news story, follow-up story comes on the TV in the salon. And she said, she leaned over and whispered in my ear, she said, you know, they say it was the husband's fault.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you wonder, one, who the fuck is they? But there is a sort of universal feeling among the human species. I think that's who she's talking about when she said they said it was the husband's fault. I think she meant the whole entire human species, that everybody wanted a man to blame for that crime. And there were people locally that did blame that. That guy, Andrea Yates's husband, was totally innocent of this thing. Not only that, did she demonstrated consciousness of guilt by trying to hide the bodies and hide what she had done from authorities. And the local press went after the husband.
Right.
And
he didn't keep her from doing it. That was
he should have done something. He must have been treating her poorly, something like, because no woman would ever drown all 5 of her children. And the scene, they did report on it. It was a horrific scene of the children trying desperately to get away as she drug them down the hall and put them in the bathtub. This horrible, horrible circumstance. And the best the human race can come up with is it's the guy's fault.
Yeah.
And I think that's the natural reaction. You know, that's the gynocentrism that we're all dealing with, and this makes life so difficult for men.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
as we see in this case.
This
And I was
default.
thinking about another story too that I think I might have mentioned once before, but it was so striking, and I'll send a link to it so that people can look at it if they want. And it was a woman who killed her 2 children by essentially throwing them off a parking garage, the roof of a parking garage, multi-story. And it was on Christmas Day, not this year, but last year, 2019. And the report was bizarre because it said at one point, I mean, again, like all the circumlocutions and the hesitancies and the difficulty actually saying the reality of what she had done. Some reports said things like, police believe that, Boston woman, this happened in Boston woman had, her children had already fallen off the building when she herself jumped. And like they did not fall off the building. There were passers-by that heard the children screaming while, just before she pushed them off. One of them was just a baby in arms, and I think one was 4 years old. But these journalists could not bring themselves to say that she had hurled her children down to their deaths before she herself jumped. It was so weird. Yeah,
this bias runs deep. Gynocentrism runs silent and it runs deep. People don't even know they have it, and it's deeply embedded in people. So the more we can help people bring that out and say, oops, there, I'm acting in a gynocentric manner, the better we are. Because people don't know they got it.
This story gives us a great example of just how silent and deep this run and how unconscious it is. Because I have to imagine the people writing these stories are not sitting there saying, oh, we better not talk about what the woman did because we don't want people to know that a woman hacked her children up with a butcher knife. They were just on fully automatic.
Exactly.
Running their story. Oh, there's no need to talk about the cause of death.
And it's not just the general public, it's the mental health profession too. And let's give an example of that. This is a book called Mothers Who Kill Their Children, Understanding the Acts of Moms from Susan Smith to the Prom Mom. And this is written by...
That's what we got to do. We got to understand, right?
Yeah. This is written by a psychologist, a female psychologist, and a female lawyer, I believe. But listen to this. Through vivid sketches of the lives of women who have killed their children, Meyer and Oberman shatter the myth that such mothers are necessarily mad or monstrous. Okay. This carefully researched account shows how social forces can contribute to both the causes and the cures for infanticide. Readers will find themselves shifting from asking, how could she do that, to how could we have let that happen to her?
That's amazing.
And that review was written by an MD, Chief of Women's Mental Health Services, University of Illinois at Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, can you believe that? How could we have that, let that happen to her? It's like, we're responsible. She's not responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it couldn't be more clearly spelled out there.
That's
that really
crazy.
is remarkable, Tom. Yeah.
And if you look at People magazine, talking about Andrea Yates, villain or victim, this is the default is, we need to find a way that she is a victim, you know? Crazy, crazy stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, like I don't have a firm position on this since it's way outside my area of knowledge. Whether compassion or demand for accountability should dominate in these cases. I suspect that every case is individual. In some cases, probably the parent who kills is deserving of empathy.
Yes.
In other cases, the parent who kills is not, for whatever reason, because that person was a monster of selfishness or egoism or just evil. But it's the fact that it's so clearly gendered, like it's unbelievable. The inability to imagine that any man who did this might himself have had reasons that we could empathize with, and the inability to imagine that any woman who did this might actually be fully responsible for her actions. It's just, I don't know. I mean,
exactly.
It's just beyond reason.
And you said it, it's gendered. I mean, the whole thing is based on whether you have a penis or not. It's not based on what the person's characteristics are, or what they did, or why they did it, or their motive, or whatever. Yeah. It's based on their sex. It's crazy.
Now, I have to admit that when I see news stories, and they do pop up from time to time, of some guy that holes up in an apartment with a gun and his 3 kids, or a guy that shoots and kills his ex-wife.
Right.
The first instinct I have is to think, well, I wonder what kind of family court nonsense this guy went through. But the thing is, and that is a valid question to ask, just like it's valid to question the mental health status of these women who are slaughtering their children.
Correct.
But in the end, when somebody kills their children or commits any kind of a murder, you have to hold them accountable. I don't care if it's a guy that got a law in family court. It's terrible. I'm sorry you got a bad time, but you don't get to slaughter your children because you didn't get your way of something.
And holding people accountable is a good thing.
People for this stuff, and to talk honestly about their crimes, but we don't. We talk very dishonestly about the crimes women commit, and we talk just as dishonestly about the crimes men commit, because we never get their mental health backstory. Correct. It's never up for discussion. Exactly. They are pieces of shit that should be condescended toward and put down,
monsters,
and thrown into the
demonized.
Monsters.
Yeah, exactly. They always are seen as killing out of, the desire for power and control. They're killing because they were absolutely without empathy for their children or their wives, and because they are, just simply through and through horrible human beings. And maybe we can look at the next slide, Tom, the one about the Australian man that killed his family last year in Australia. There's the difference. Gutless father who set family car alight, tried to stop bystanders from saving his 3 children as they burned to death inside, as his wife's desperate last words as she was engulfed in flames are revealed. Now, okay, this is a slightly different situation. It would have been impossible even if the police wanted to hide the nature of the deaths here. It was obviously well seen by everybody. So there was no possibility of keeping that hidden. But, here it is. Talk about evil agency leading the story. This is, and we're absolutely directed from the very first word as to how we're to regard this man. Exactly. And of course, this was a case where the police said, well, we're interested in trying to figure out the motive. One police officer said he was asking people to come forward who knew something about the family situation, because this was a case where there was a custody dispute ongoing. This man was in the midst of a divorce, and I think the backstory is that he was about to lose contact with his children. Right. And maybe the police knew something about that. The police knew this family. There was a history of domestic violence. I don't know the details, but that when the police officer said that they were keeping an open mind and wanted to investigate motive, I think he was forced to at least make a public apology. He may even have been disciplined in some way. The outcry, the anger, how dare you suggest that this man had a reason other than simply his toxic masculinity.
Right. Crazy, crazy.
I think we should have a lengthy discussion about this poor man's tragedy, his plight in the world. I mean, if we're going to treat both sexes the same way, then we need to have a discussion about what this poor man was going through. And I know it's like getting burned to death is really a bad thing, but this guy had struggles. He really did. And I think he deserves our compassion. And I thought we should understand this is a mental health issue. This isn't even really a criminal matter. We should call in social services to give this guy some counseling and maybe help him out. And of course, if I am not doing that tongue in cheek, people freak out. Yeah. And it is tongue in cheek. The guy deserves to fry in my book, but so does she.
Yeah, well, that's it. The double standards are just so glaring. The brutality of any crime will be explained away through sympathy for the poor woman's troubles in the case where she's done something terrible. And there is absolutely no interest in understanding why a man gets to the point that he kills his own children and then, as in this case, kills himself too.
Correct. Imagine that first article started off by saying, "Gutless mother murders 3 children." It's like, gutless mother. You'll never ever see that. You know, and this particular article, they go on to talk. They call him everything in the book: monster, gutless, all kinds of nasty names. You never saw anyone call the mother nasty names in that first article.
No.
It's interesting, but they both did the same thing. They killed their kids. You know? Crazy. Gynocentrism on steroids.
And it isn't, I think gynocentrism on steroids is a natural state of affairs in the world.
It is.
Especially in the West. It is just absolutely, people don't even think about this. I guarantee you there's 1,000 journalists out there that would look at this story that we've got on the screen now and then look at the most recent one where she murdered her kids and say, what's the problem?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that's their nature. I mean, it's on board. It's like that's just the way people think. Crazy. Speaking of which, should we switch to Sweden?
Yeah, let's look at that one.
Enough of this tragedy.
Well, this one's kind of tragic too, Paul. It's kind of tragic too.
Now, this is an old story, or relatively, I think it was back in 2011.
Yeah.
And a good friend of ours just alerted us to it, but it's just another remarkable example of these same kind of gynocentric double standards. Here was a child pornography ring in Sweden, and there wasn't very much information in the article about what exactly some of the material that was being passed around was pictures, some was actual video, I think, and all the 24 people who were involved were found guilty. But the only person who was actually given a jail sentence was the one man involved, the 23 women involved, and everybody in the story is startled that there were any women involved at all. But here they were, 23 of them, and they were all given either just fines or what was the word now? The phrase conditional sentence, which I guess means that basically you serve it. I'm not sure what that means.
If they don't rob a bank, they don't go to jail. If they break the law, they'll throw them in the clink.
So they're just basically the term is not on parole, but what is the term? I don't know. It's a suspended sentence basically.
Probation,
that's it.
But they let them all off and put him in jail.
Yeah, even though it's, well, I mean, the only
And
reason I suppose was that he was apparently the one that he was sort of the instigator, but they were
of
all
course,
enthusiastic and perfectly well aware participants, equally involved in the circulation of this material. Yeah, it was just amazing.
you got to.
And you had the
Yeah,
money
you got to
line
see the
there.
quote from this article that just says it all. And there it is. Although the court decided that the women had chosen to receive the material and were responsible for their own actions, it also said that most of them were not well balanced individuals and that the man had taken advantage of this.
So their source for the kiddie porn
Oh,
was
God.
taking advantage of them.
God.
They're victims.
They've
Mhm.
turned it
They're
around
not
so
child
the.
pornographers. They're not criminals. They're victims.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they
Mhm.
found a way to turn it into women into victims and the guy into the perpetrator.
Yeah.
It's
It's
just so
incredible.
natural for people. They don't
Yeah.
even know they're
Yeah.
doing it. You know?
Yeah, as if this guy was a well-balanced individual.
Exactly.
Of
Uh,
course
you
he
know,
was.
uh, you
Exactly.
know, it is. It's astounding. Like Sonia Starr mentions this in her excellent study out of the University of Michigan. I think she's a professor of law there, and she did an extensive study, the one that found that men are sentenced, 65% higher than women for the same crimes. And, she went through everything, like women are far less likely to be arrested at all, far less likely to be charged, far
Yes.
more likely to be given a plea deal, far less likely to be found guilty, in the first place. And then even once they are convicted, they're, 65% less, the sentences they receive are 65% less severe than the man sentence. And she made the obvious point that men who end up in doing these things, men who become criminals, are also victims. The vast majority are led into their life of crime by
Yes.
somebody else. They come from deprived backgrounds. They're often the victims of abuse. They're
Correct.
often coming from broken homes. They
Yep.
come from poverty. They have
Yep.
substance abuse problems, everything. So if we're going to care about the status of the person and use that as a mitigating factor, which, I don't object to, and as long as it means that we don't cease to hold people responsible for their crimes. But if we're going to care about those things and take them into account and think about how we can make people's lives better so that they don't commit crime, I'm all for that. But we never do it in the cases of male perpetrators. We only do it in every single case of female perpetrators, no matter how heinous the crime, even when, it comes to murder. Women
Yep.
who murder their children, women who murder men, are always given a way out as a result of their alleged victim status. And
Battered
I
woman
just, yeah, I
syndrome.
found it, yeah, battered women syndrome. We don't even know that that's a real syndrome. And yet it's now used frequently as a defense, even when the man is dead and can't possibly defend himself against the claims that the woman is making about his abuse of her.
Yep. And that
Or
kind
you
of thing
even
lives
got
on.
who was the Canadian professor that wrote a book apparently asserting that women can't be accountable for murdering their husbands, that they are
Yeah, that's Elizabeth
legitimately.
Sheehy. Yeah.
Yes,
Elizabeth Sheehy. She's a University of Ottawa professor in the, I can't remember now whether she's in the sociology department or the criminology department. And yeah, she has a book called Battered Women on Trial. And she even would say to you, "Oh no, Paul, I'm not making that argument. I'm simply concluding that this is what people believe," because she, through investigating various trials of women who murdered their intimate partners, found that juries in most cases were very reluctant to convict if
Right.
it could be shown or if it could be argued that these women were battered women. And she's
Yep.
all in favor, of course, of that kind of double standard.
Yep.
and I think it has to be said, although I know that some won't like it, but when you look at who is actually meting out consequences, who's making the decisions about how people are punished, it's not feminists that are doing it. It's not even mostly women. It's conservative men who see themselves in the chivalric model, sitting up on white horses, donning robes, of course, and passing down consequences, rescuing female criminals at every turn from their own action.
Yep. Gynocentrism leaks into just about everything, including the judiciary.
Yeah.
Yep. And including people who we would otherwise very much agree with on political matters and some social matters when it comes to how they deal with the realities of women's behavior and men's behavior. They're totally out of their minds. Yeah.
It's true.
And I mean, there was, who was it? Deborah LaFave's attorney got away with saying after she was had been charged with having sex with a boy that was underage, the guy told the judge, her attorney told the judge that she was too pretty to go to jail, and the judge nodded.
Shocking.
Oh, man.
And this is a guy doing it. He's not thinking this is an outrageous thing to say.
Right.
He thinks he's making his case in court.
And he was. And he did a good job. He got her off, right?
Yeah, I think she and the guy she abused are still together now.
Yeah. Crazy, crazy.
But yeah, I mean, we could give examples that we would never run it. We could sit here and talk for hours because this is throughout our culture all the time.
Yeah.
Yep. It's every place. Yep. Are we finished?
I think that you mean
I
as a
think we
species?
are.
I'm afraid that may be the truth.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, I think we're done. This is just another tragedy, and it's also a good opportunity for me to put a little plug in for Regarding Men.
Indeed.
Guys, if you want some sane conversation, I think that's the number one product of Regarding Men is sane conversation.
Indeed it is.
We have groups running every day of the week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. There's always something going on at regardingmen.com/join. Join us there. You can hook up with other Red Pill guys. It's a men-only forum. And talk to your heart's content without looking over your shoulder. I think you'll find it very refreshing.
Indeed. Well said. Yeah.
So I guess we will end by saying that men
are
good. We did it. Not bad. Not too shabby. It was a Mexican standoff for a while.
Yeah.
I almost said it. Oh, God. So we'll see you guys. Y'all take care.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.